Go Black Podcast.
Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on what time you're listening to this. My name is Umar, and this is the Dope Black Dads podcast. Today, we're going to be speaking with Decoteau J. Irby, who is an associate professor at the University of Illinois in Chicago in the Department of Educational Policy Studies. He's the author of Stuck Improving, which is Racial Equality and School Leadership, which is a book that has been published recently, and it was published in September of last year, and you can buy it at all good bookstores all around the world. And we're going to be speaking about the racial systems and how it's kind of working in schools and kind of the work that Decoteau and his colleagues have been doing to kind of try and change the narrative and try to change a lot of the issues that are being faced in schools, especially when we're dealing with racism. Obviously, in the last few years, we've had numerous issues, and the killing of George Floyd really brought to prominence a lot of the issues with regards to racism that people are facing within the workplace, but also within schools as well. I know here in the UK, there's been lots of debate and discussion around changing the way that race is talked about within schools, because there's a lot of controversy regarding the fact that, you know, we're talking about it in such a way to kind of eradicate history, but actually the whole issue is not to eradicate history, but to learn from it. So wanted to obviously welcome Decoteau to the podcast. Welcome.
So again, my name is Decoteau Irby. A lot of people call me DJ. That's why I have the J in my name. I grew up in South Carolina, and in a very kind of different region, a small kind of rural area, small town feel, and I live in Chicago. The journey that brought me to Chicago is one with a lot of twists and turns. I grew up with my mom and my sisters in South Carolina. I attended College of Charleston in South Carolina, and then eventually found my way to Philadelphia. When I was in Philadelphia, I volunteered to, I'm going to date myself, I volunteered to teach young people how to use email and how to use Microsoft Word. And in that process of volunteering with young people, that was my first time really being in an educational setting. At the time, I was working at the mall at Sunglass Hut and just felt like I needed to do something more meaningful, and found that I really loved it. I enjoyed working with young people. I got them, we kind of clicked, and that's what kind of led me into education. I started working with youth who have been involved in the criminal justice system, as well as working with youth who are pretty much kind of like on the margins of society, students who lived in public housing and that sort of thing. And I just really enjoyed my time working with them. That led me to pursue a PhD in urban education. And what I found when I was working with those young people was that even when they did everything that they needed to do, their families did everything they needed to do, they stayed in school, they, got as good of grades as they could get, stayed out of trouble, had supportive families who were supportive, but oftentimes were low income or poor. But they did everything that they were told to do. And the system still didn't work out for them. Oftentimes they still weren't able to go to college. So I saw this repeated process of students following all of the steps of the so-called that are required to achieve the so-called American dream. And it still did not work out the way that they hoped. And a lot of their kind of like hopes and dreams were dashed. So that's what led me to become interested in understanding educational systems in the United States. And I pursued my PhD at Temple University. And then I worked at a couple universities. And in 2015, I joined the University of Illinois at Chicago's Department of Educational Policy Studies. That brings me to where I am today.
Wow. I mean, it sounds like you've taken something that was a passion to begin with, obviously, in terms of helping children and young people to navigate the education system and to get themselves into a position where they could better themselves, to actually being in a point where you realize, okay, so we're encouraging people to do all of this, but they achieve all of the goals that they're meant to achieve. But when they come out the other end of it, suddenly they're stuck. So when you've gone through that process over the last few years, and then you've realized that these children and young people are now stuck, what then did you kind of feel you needed to do to kind of try and challenge this or understand a bit more as to why this is?
Yeah, well, I think the big kind of awakening for me, which I knew this in theory, but
Mm,
to see it play out like with so many young people and so many families was really like eye opening for me. But really, what I understood is that individual and even collective effort is important,
mm,
but um, even with the tremendous amount of effort, individual, effort that people put forward, following steps, taking all the steps that people say are required, if
mm-hmm,
the system is not set up and established to help you win, to ensure your success, it's very difficult. You're almost swimming against the tide, right? So
mm,
you can be paddling and trying to go against that tide, but you're still going upriver. It's going to be a Herculean effort. And
mm,
so what I realized is that if the system is working against people, then it's not that we need to. We do need to encourage people to put forth effort, to try all those sorts of things, but
mm,
we also need to be as interested and as committed to trying to change the actual system itself.
mm-hmm.
So, in other words, to redirect the river so that as people are paddling, they have the river, they have the flow behind them as opposed to
Yeah.
against them. And so that's really what helped me become interested in understanding organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And my book, Stuck Improving, really focuses on organizational change. My goal and my commitment as a scholar is to try to figure out how to change the systems so that the systems work in concert with all of the effort that people are putting in to actually improve their lives.
Mm. So obviously within your book, there's a number of running themes within it, and I think one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is, what do you think it means for educators to study themselves, interrogate policies, and reimagine practices with increasingly diverse student populations that we're now seeing in suburban schools? I think not just in the US, but over here in the UK, you are seeing a huge explosion of diversity. So what do you think can be done to look at these things?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, you know, uh, what's required is that educators, people in positions of power, the people
Mm,
whose behaviors and actions uphold whatever the system is, really begin to think about the system in a different way. And
mhm,
so, if we, because a lot of times what we see in education is everybody, not everybody, but many people, educators, even parents included, put a tremendous amount of pressure and emphasis on changing the students, the behaviors of parents, for
mhm,
example. But really, if we could change and rethink how the schools actually function to support
mhm,
parents and support students and support communities, we would, be in a better position to make sure that all of those efforts that young people and families put into their education actually pay off. I think one of the challenges with that, though, is that the vast majority of people who actually work in the education system have actually benefited from it. And when
mm,
you benefit from something and when it has worked well for you, it's
mhm,
very difficult to have to adopt a deep commitment and to develop a willingness to actually change the system that has worked for you. And
mhm,
so, that's the challenge. I even with my own children, I'm always trying to be mindful of like, okay, how much should I be balancing? Like, if you do this, you're gonna do well because I did it and it worked out for me.
mm,
It doesn't necessarily mean it's gonna work the same way for everyone else. Um, and so I think that the big challenge in terms of getting people to reflect and think about what they can do differently and to imagine differently is to let go of the narrative that the system works and instead shift the narrative from the system works to the system happened to work for me.
mm.
But it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for everybody else. And if we could
So,
adopt
yeah.
that kind of perspective, then it
Mm.
will open up our possibility to say, how can I make this work for people who don't have the same experience that I have?
So when you say experience, are you saying that obviously we're both black men? So are we saying that the experience is being a person of color in the school system, or is it that your experience depends on your socio-economic background, for example? Is your work suggesting that actually the school system itself is possibly, and I'm just throwing it out there, but there's possible institutional racism that exists within the school structures, and that's why some people can navigate that and get away from that and be successful, but others can't. No matter how hard they try, they're not going to be able to do that. So, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's all the above, everything that you're saying. These institutions favor and work for people who have power. So they work for white people. They work for people who have wealth, who have financial resources. In the United States, they work for people who live in more affluent neighborhoods, right? So all of these things, all of these kind of, all of these positions of power, all of these, whiteness, class, gender, all of these things work in particular people's favor. And likewise, the system works against you when you're not any of those things, when you don't live in a particular affluent neighborhood, when you live in a poor community or poor neighborhood, or if you're black, or if you're, a black woman, or if you're a black male. All of those things compound and intersect to put people at a marked disadvantage in comparison to, for example, a white family who lives in an affluent neighborhood or area. The school systems work pretty well for them. And policymakers want those people in their schools, right? They want affluent people in their schools. They feel that it makes their schools better, right? Even if we think about not only education policy, but housing policy, like there's this assumption in the U.S. that housing policy should focus on developing kind of like these mixed income, multi-income, multiracial kind of communities. The assumption in that is that if poor people can be in close proximity to people who have more wealth, that they're going to be better off. I think there's a little bit of merit to that in terms of like the networks and social relationships they form, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that this kind of social class mixing is the panacea for poor people. The panacea to help poor people is to invest the educational, the workforce, the resources into people so they're no longer poor. That's the solution. The solution to eliminating poverty is not to put people in poverty in close proximity with people in wealth. In fact, that often reinforces it's like, how about you just come and work for me at my house and clean my house or something? The real solution is to actually make the kinds of investments into people that will allow them to be able to kind of flourish. And so if we think about schools in the same way, we really need to think about wholesale change to how we're funding schools, to what resources are provided to schools. Like, we could have policies where the best teachers go to and are encouraged and incentivized to teach the students who need it the most. And instead, you get the, teachers are incentivized to go to, if they're the most talented teachers, are often incentivized to go to and to remain at the schools where the families are affluent, the students are going to do well, regardless of whether that, top tier teacher is there or not. So,
I think, No, I was just going to say, I think it's interesting that you mentioned about the, kind of the mixing, social economic mixing, because, here in the UK, like, for example, in London, and I'm sure, well, I say that, I'm sure, but, possibly you would have heard of what happened in Grenfell Tower a few years ago. So when the block of flats in West London caught fire and several, a lot of people sadly passed away in that fire. And I think what's interesting about that particular area in London is that here you have, on the one side of the road, you've obviously got Grenfell Tower. There's a lot of people who don't have the same level of income, high levels of income in that area. But then you kind of cross the road, and then suddenly you've got these massive mansions, £1 million houses, and I can see the point that you're making. That it's almost it's a bit of a fallacy to think that, okay, because I happen to live next to a rich person, that their richness is going to rub off on me like some kind of magic dust that's going to suddenly be like, oh yeah, I'm going to be rich as well. And actually, if you think about it, it could be more of a disenchantment towards them, because they kind of feel like, actually, well, I could never get to this point, and this is kind of almost rubbing it in my face, because how am I meant to aspire to this just because that person happens to live next to me. Not saying by the same token that, if you're living with people who are of the same kind of social economic background as you, that you can't aspire. But I do think it is a bit of a fallacy to suggest, that by mixing people in that way that you're going to suddenly see this change. And obviously, history dictates that hasn't really happened. And I'm not sure if there's anywhere in the world where they've tried that as an experiment and that's actually worked. But yeah, I think it's interesting as well in terms of like the structures within the schools. What do you think needs to change then? Because there is an argument that can be made that actually, well, I can still be a poor black man or woman or person of color who comes from a low socioeconomic background, but can still make it within that system. A classic example, your former president, Barack Obama. He didn't come from a rich family, and he went and became, president of the number one, highest office in the land, in the country, some would say in the world. So how do we kind of try and navigate all of that, and what can be done to kind of try and address those issues, really?
Yeah. Well, I think that part of it is, for me, I think a redistribution of like wealth resources. And when I say wealth resources, I'm not only talking about financial resources. I'm talking about history, right? Knowledge, um, culture, really amplifying and lifting up the cultural assets that exist amongst, specifically since we're talking about black folks. I mean, we also have to keep in mind that, Barack Obama learned a tremendous amount from living and working right alongside, poor people and being an organizing poor people on the south side of Chicago. So even if we think about the success of his campaign, he used grassroots fundraising approaches, right? $25 per person. He didn't, that's what really got him going. So that particular approach to raising money is an approach that, we don't see like wealthy, affluent people use. Like wealthy, affluent people go find a friend or a few friends, and that's how they get their money. That's how they get their campaign money. You know what I'm saying?
True. Yeah, it's true.
Think about the tradition of black people all over the globe. How we make the cookout happen, or how we send such and such to college, is we go and we say such and such is gonna go. We're gonna pray on such and such.
Yeah, real talk.
And it's gonna happen.
Yeah.
And everybody like, yeah, it is gonna happen. And everybody drop $5 in the basket. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And that vote of confidence, that belief in our ability to persist and to thrive, is what ends up kind of like moving us and kind of like carrying us forward. So I think that the reason I wanted to mention that is that if we think about how we do things, there's this kind of, and I don't want to be a sensualist, but there's this way of doing things that black people, that poor people embrace and use and have used historically, that gets us to another place, and that's a form of wealth. And so when I'm talking about like the wealth and the assets that we bring, it will look very different. For example, in schools, if you're in an affluent school and the way of making sure that everybody gets to go on a field trip or has a STEM kit to do their science projects is to go and, the parents for the more affluent kids are going to be able to take care of it and afford it. There has to be different ways of thinking about how to ensure people have opportunities. And so there's a way that we do it in our communities, and schools don't necessarily do it that way. They say, here's a fee, and everybody pays the same fee to have access to, this STEM opportunity or this field trip and that sort of thing. So I think that I'm talking about this because it's really about a pretty substantial reimagining of how to make schools work for black people. And we have in black institutions some clues for how
Sorry, could you just hold it a second? Sorry, I'm just going to mark the clip. Just going to pause it there. Somebody's knocking at my door and I'm the only person in, so just bear with me a second. Hello, I'm so sorry about that. Yes, I think my wife's ordered something, so and she's not here, so I had to
No
go and
worries,
collect
no
that.
worries.
So yeah, what I'll do, I've marked the clip anyway, and I'll just tell them so we can kind of edit it. We'll edit it in a little bit, but I think yeah, it's interesting what you say about kind of the mentality that we have, Black community in terms of, it is a community in terms of how we operate, and like you say, when when one person shows promise, we're kind of like, okay, let's pray on it, let's contribute what we can. How do you think that that kind of way of doing things could be implemented in schools, or is it that schools are, I suppose in suburban schools, I can see the point that they are probably restricted with finances in terms of trying to ensure every student has the same opportunity. But for those that are in the affluent schools, do you think that there's a responsibility for the schools to say, okay, well, we recognize that we've got some students who are not from an affluent background, so therefore we'll either do this as a flat fee that everyone that we know can afford, or the school will heavily subsidize in this case? I mean, what's your take on that?
Yeah, and schools do that, right? So, to be fair, there are schools, especially schools that have those resources. They absolutely do that, and the schools that don't try to seek out grants and that sort of thing. I think that above and beyond the financial piece, it's kind of like it's almost the cultural kind of like ethos or spirit of the place, right?
Mm,
And so, what I was trying to describe is really about kind of like the spirit of abundance that we try to move within.
mm.
And thinking about organizations and how the culture of organizations, in particular the culture of schools, they're not places that really assume abundance and potential
Mm,
and the ability for people to flourish and that sort of thing. And
mhm,
so a lot of it has to do with how policies, how financial resources get distributed, how policies get created and implemented, what curriculum is taught, and how people are interacting with the young people on an assumption that they can actually do something great, right?
mhm,
And that they already are great, and that they bring something great, and that
mm,
the goal and the objective of you being in this institution is for people to pull it out of you, right? To pull whatever
mm,
that greatness is out of you. And so that's how I kind of, so I don't think that schools operate that way.
mm,
And so I think that part of the issue and part of the problem is that they don't. Whereas we know that like Black communities and Black institutions do operate on a different set of assumptions about our potential. Um, and part of racism is that, the one of the powers of racism is that the belief that Black people don't have
mm,
potential is baked into the institutions, and it's
mhm,
baked into everything that we do. And so it's almost like there's certain people who show a particular kind of promise or potential can get the institutions and the people who uphold them will gravitate towards them. But there's not
mhm,
this wholesale belief that people have potential in the same way, for example, that people believe about white children. Like people
mm,
in the United States, you know, white children, get treated as though like they have tremendous potential.
mm.
Um,
Yeah,
they don't get that's the default, right? They have to do something oftentimes egregious to be
mhm,
treated as though they don't have potential and they don't have redemption, right? And we see
mm,
this in, for example, like you mentioned, George Floyd. Like that's a concrete example, right? Like
mm,
he's guilty. He can't be up to any good.
mhm,
He can't be redeemed. So we have to stand. We have to kneel on him and hold him down for this
mm.
because there's nothing good that can come from this human being.
Yeah, literally, yeah.
And the white people as a whole get a totally different set of treatment. They get the benefit of the doubt that they're having a mental health crisis, that they
Yes,
can be redeemed, right?
yeah,
So
yes.
all of these institutions, whether it's policing institutions and the criminal justice system, or whether it's schools, treat Black people in a way that suggests that they don't have potential, redemptive quality, so on and so forth. And that's the default, unless somebody in that system happens to believe or think otherwise about you. And most Black people can name who those people were in their schools. For me,
Absolutely.
I had a teacher, I had a couple teachers, Miss Barron, Miss Willoughby, and my guidance counselor, Miss Gregory.
Mm,
3 people,
mm,
right? So most of the time when you ask a black person who are the 3 to 5
Yeah.
people in your educational career who believe in you, that's a shame that out of the whole educational career, most of us can name 3 to 5 if we can do that.
Yeah, that's true. No, you're right, and I think you're right. There is that default position that's adopted when it comes to black people that we're not worthy, we're not on the same kind of level as everybody else. I mean, I come from an African background, and I think it's interesting being a Nigerian born here in the UK. I think my parents came over with the mentality about the emphasis on education, education, education. So it was very much drummed into me from a very early age, and you can actually see. And when I reflect back on my school experiences myself, there was a difference between how African children were treated and how people from the Caribbean were treated. So I think there was more, teachers almost took on a default that, okay, we're not going to go down the whole route of it's all black people, but actually we're just going to marginalize that it's actually the Caribbeans. They're not interested in studying. They're not interested in doing this. That they want to do all the negative things that you can think of. But it's the African students who are the more studious ones who want to study, etc., etc. And I think when you're having to deal with that from a very early age, I think you can take it all the way back to like preschool years, because preschool teachers will have this concept of what a black person is. Therefore, you're almost doomed to fail right from the beginning when you enter an institute of education, because your narrative has been set, and then we're spending time as black people trying to shatter that narrative in
Yeah.
order to get ahead. So we're having to deal with a lot of the negativity, all the BS that comes along with people's thoughts. And actually it's like, oh, you know what, it's great. I didn't realize, as a black person, you'd be interested in studying the Second World War, for example, and looking at it from this perspective. Or, oh, you like science? Amazing. I just thought you'd be into sports and and all of that. So, so I think it's interesting that happens. But I think from your perspective, obviously you've been doing a lot of work on this, and no doubt you do a lot of overtime dealing with this kind of stuff. So how do you kind of measure and interpret what small gains that you are getting from the work that you're doing from those that are struggling the most?
Yeah. A lot of it has to do with it's very difficult to say kind of like measurable, but so I have another a chapter that I wrote in a book called Dignity Affirming Education.
Hmm.
And in that particular book, in the introduction chapter that I wrote, I write about the concept of dignity and this kind of idea of a deep sense of self. So one of the things that I look for is like it's very difficult to describe, and probably even more difficult to measure. But it's something about the way that people carry themselves, where you can kind of tell what they're about, right? And so sometimes even in the young people that I work with, and when I did this particular research project, um, I asked a lot of people, like, how do you know when you're working with, and this was focused on males of color, black males and Latino males in the United States. And I would ask, how do you know when your work and the investments that you're making in terms of like putting this young person on a positive path for their life, how do you know when it's working? And they would say things like, it's difficult to measure, but I know it when I see it because they walk differently, they carry themselves in a kind of different way. And so when they were describing it, they would kind of like put their shoulders up. The walk is a little bit more like the walk is like I'm going somewhere. I'm not just meandering and wandering. And so they would say that they knew that their work had paid off when they could see these small kind of like things being communicated about their sense of being and who they are in the world that the young people might not necessarily verbalize, but you can see like how they're walking into that building, right? So it's almost like if you look at athletes, or last night I was watching the US Open, I was looking at Serena Williams. There was a time in the match where you could almost, she didn't have to say it, you could see when she was just like struggling, but then you can see when she was like, oh, she's gonna win now, right?
Yeah.
Because of how she was approaching the line to serve. And so there's these things that I think resonate with me and resonate with people in terms of just like how people are walking from point A to point B. And I can even see it. Like I can see a young person, how they're walking into the room, how they're here to the down the block, right? There's a certain kind of way of moving through the world that reflects a sense of self, that in a sense of belief that I have a contribution to make to this world as a human being. Whatever that might be.
Yeah,
Those are the kind of things that are very difficult to touch because, when we start talking about these different modes of communication, we're moving outside of the kind of westernized paradigm of like how you perform on a math test. You know what I'm saying? How you perform on a standardized test and that sort of thing. And we're thinking about people in a much more holistic way, and we're communicating by how they move through the world. Those are the things that I really tend to look for, and I wish there was some kind of way to measure them. But I found that most educators and parents and adults, they know it when they see it.
Absolutely. And I think, for me as a black man, like and obviously you as a black man as well, but I think the way that people move with a certain swagger, you can just tell straight off. And I think one of the things that I loved, watching between 2008 and 2016 when Barack Obama was president, just watching that he just brought a next level swagger to the office of presidency. Like you've never seen a president. In fact, I don't think you've ever seen a world leader move in the way that he did. He just from the moment he just put on his jacket, coming down Air Force One, just he owned every single room that he ever walked in. And I think I know there's a lot of controversies about what did he do in terms of helping black people and whatnot, and that's a whole different discussion we won't get into today. But I think certainly on a kind of visual level, it showed this can be you. Like you can do this. I remember having conversations. In fact, it wasn't even. I remember it was watching Chris Rock, one of Chris Rock's specials in the early 2000s. Dave Chappelle. All of these comedians talk about how we'll never have a black president. And I think the closest I remember seeing a black president was the Chris Rock and Bernie Grant film that they did. That was kind of a bit of a that was a great film, hilarious. Yeah. So I think for everyone it's like, cool, all right, yeah. Well, this is as close as we're going to get to having a black president in a while. But actually, fast forward less than 10 years, and suddenly we've got a black president. And I think, is there something to be said? Waxing lyrical aside, but is there something to be said about the fact that schools as an institute, schools in the way that they move, education systems as they work now, the traditional education system, there needs to be something that's built alongside of that or integrated within the existing establishment to be able to recognize some of these things. So I know, like here in the UK, for example, there's been a lot of emphasis in terms of apprenticeships and trainees and kind of trying to move young people away from, traditional do your math, your science and your English and, go to university, but actually think about getting apprenticeships from an early age. Do you think that more needs to be done alongside of, the existing education structures to be able to recognize that actually some young people are not suited for traditional education, but if we have something else that's there that they can excel in, they will excel, and we can recognize that?
Yeah. I think that there's multiple pathways, and success is something that should be defined by the people who experience it. And I think too, not just like this singular idea of success, but that as you go through life, you have hopefully successes, right? At different stages in your life. Like what it looks like to be successful at one stage may not be what success looks like or feels like at another stage. But I do think that that's really important. I think part of that is, one of the things that I think is really important is to have young people having access to adults and institutions that give them a range of different opportunities to experience and try things. And when I say experience and try, I also mean it's, the opportunities to fail and bounce back, right? And so I would love if schools had, a broader range of things. So for example, you can try out music. If it don't work out for you, it's not the end of the day. We trying it out. Try out art, performing arts. Try out, sports. there's all of these different things that the ability to try these things out is so closely tied to one's financial, situation, family income, and that sort of thing. And so you get students that get like a wide range of opportunities to try whatever they want to try, fencing, and not be very good at it. And say, okay, I'm not good at that, or I'm not good at it, but I still want to do it. And so I think that all of these different sorts of things, and we're starting to think about success not as only tied to the labor market. The labor market and work opportunities is one piece of it, but really having people be able to do things that help them thrive, flourish, be happy, have outlets so that they're mentally well, and those sorts of things are really important. And I think one of the keys to being able to do that is to have people in schools that can relate to young people and children and teenagers and see they self in them. I think that one of the reasons that I was, successful, I don't know if this is something that you can replicate, but the sense of humor that the teenagers that I worked with brought with them, and I was just like, this is hilarious. Like, what they did is a problem, but I would have did the exact same thing when I was in high school, right? So thinking about those kind of things and being able to like take it seriously, but then go home and be able to laugh about it and be like, wow, this is funny. This is a trip. Or this student said this, and so I can say that, like, when I was working with high schoolers in Philadelphia, like, I got cussed out pretty bad on occasion. You know what I'm saying? Somebody be like, get the F out of my face, da 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 da. You know what I'm saying? So I'm like, whoa. So I'm like, you know what I'm saying? Are you done? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
All right, so let's get back to this work. But my thing is that I would go home, I would tell somebody, and I'd be like, the way that this student put these words together to cuss me out was brilliant. The delivery was brilliant. Like, everything about it was brilliant. Like, this person could go and be a stand-up or an orator, or the challenge now is to take your mastery of the spoken word and be able to take that mastery of a spoken word and translate it into multiple different mediums. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so take that kind of stuff, like, okay, like, you done, all right, but I never looked at them as someone who, like, all they know is cuss words, right? I would think about them as, this person has a really, really special way of using cuss words, because everybody can use the cuss words, but this young person knows how to use them in a really special way. It really signals that you have a gift with words, and that when you speak, you have a particular kind of presence. And so now my responsibility is not to say, my responsibility and commitment is to helping you be more expansive in the words that you use, how you use them, XYZ, so you can find your way into different doors and find different avenues for yourself.
Yeah.
But I can't do that if I think this child is broken and unredeemable because they cuss.
Is that to do? I mean, I completely hear what you're saying, because I'm a lawyer by trade, but before I was a lawyer, I was working in the youth sector. So I worked with young people, similar to what you did. And I recognize, similar to what you're saying, that there were some young people who, if you put them in the traditional system, they would get chewed up straight away, because it's like, you're cussing, we're not seeing the worth. But actually, when you're looking at it from a completely different angle, like what you did, which is to say, actually, okay, yeah, I need to tell them off, of course, because that kind of behavior is not acceptable.
Right.
But there is a gift there because of what they're able to do. And and again, let me be very clear about what I'm about to say next. I'm not condoning drug dealing or drug use in any way, shape, or form. That's not what I'm about to say. But I think I've had this discussion loads of times with people, like friends of mine, where you will see young people who are dealing drugs. It's facts, it happens. And there's this entrepreneurial spirit about them, the way that they kind of organize themselves, the way that they are dealing in whatever they do. So it's kind of like saying, well, okay, yeah, obviously that what they're doing is bad and it's illegal, but how can we harvest that skill set that they have and turn it into something that's quite positive, and actually that can make a more meaningful, positive contribution to society? So with that said, do you think therefore that there's scope, or there's a need to perhaps for teachers to be more cognizant of those types of things, and not looking at things from a traditional teacher's lens of, if you cuss, if you swear, you're a bad person, or if you're dealing drugs, you're a bad person. But actually trying to train teachers to look beyond that, and actually saying, well, actually, yes, all these bad things are happening, but one, we need to understand why it's happening. Two, we need to understand where it's coming from. But three, there is something there that we can work with, and actually we shouldn't just be sending them off to another system that will have no interest in them, and they may possibly end up in prison or in jail later on down the line. But actually we can harness that. So do you think there's scope for teachers to get that, or do you think that there needs to be an overall kind of institutional change?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would love if teachers brought that with them. I think it's highly unlikely, but I think it would be, I mean, people just don't have the tolerance for it, I guess it depends too on your background and how you grew up. I grew up with friends that would just cuss like sailors, you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
that's a lot too, you know what I mean? So I didn't equate the language to the language used to lack of intelligence, right? Actually, I thought that a lot of people were highly intelligent, and the same thing with, I tell this story. I had a student that just was such a memorable student. This guy, he was a real gift, and I always am curious about what he's up to and where he landed. But he was a street kid. At the place that I'm talking about, like most of the kids were, it was a life skills center for children who had been incarcerated for various different reasons. So this was their step to return to this life skills center before they were allowed to go back into a traditional school setting. This was kind of like the intermediary space. So I would and then they would kind of be like evaluated to see whether they could go back into kind of like a traditional school setting. And so, and if they couldn't make it back into a school setting, they would get like a general equivalency degree, a GED in the United States, which is, an equivalent means that doesn't have to go to, high school diploma.
Yeah.
But I mean, these students, they had some serious experiences. A lot of them kind of took care of themselves, lived on their own. And I remember I had this one particular student who was interested in, he was a street guy. And once I got him interested in understanding real estate, because we started talking about like all of the abandoned houses that were in South Philly. He was just like, yeah. And so I remember, keep in mind, this was real estate information wasn't as readily available at the time. So I started bringing him newspapers, right? He started getting the newspapers. He started looking at real estate. And it wasn't as easy just to find information at the time. But then we got online, started helping him understand how to do searches online. And I'm talking about, he would go down a rabbit hole, right? He didn't have the financial resources to actually purchase a building or anything. But his commitment to understanding the process, to understanding real estate values, the return on investment, so on and so forth. Like, he really went down a rabbit hole to where he would ask me like, yo, you bring the paper today? Because I need to look at the paper to see what's available on the market this week. And so I can remember how interested and invested he was. And I could only think what he would be able to do if he had the people, the resources, the networks, the financial resources to actually help him get into real estate. He would be a real estate mogul. 100% convinced that he had all of that potential, but the system did not provide him with the resources to be able to do it. The main outlet that he had was me bringing him a newspaper. And so he would like talk to me, and we would spend a lot of time. Like, he always was really invested in wanting to talk about these sorts of things. So I think about him, and I think about how many. His name was Curtis. I think about how many Curtises there are. Schools right now, right? And that are into more of a street life. But if they had a different outlet and could see a different possibility and had somebody who could introduce them to a different segment of the economy, right? I feel like they will flourish. And
Absolutely.
So, I think that those kind of things those are the kind of stories and examples that come to mind. And if we had, teachers and schools that could see that, and not only see it, but the capacity and capability to actually nurture that thirst that he had and that thirst that people who are like Curtis have. I think that we in the United States, many of the black communities and black people wouldn't be in the situation they're in. But this goes back to where I started our conversation, which is the system works just fine for the people who are in positions of power because they want the real estate. They don't want Curtis to have the real estate. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's the dilemma that we're in, is that like when we think about like the real estate, people who have the positions of power, whether it's in the housing market or whether it's in the educational institution, the people in the positions of power, the system works just fine for them. And until it doesn't work for them, there's really not much of an incentive for them to do anything different.
I think that is a perfect place to end this today. I think, you've dropped so many nuggets in this conversation that we've had today. And I just think it's so important. The work that you're doing is so important because I think people have to understand the way that school systems work, institutions generally, how they work, and kind of the way that they've been built in such a way that we are, for people like that look like us, that sound like us, it's not designed for us to kind of achieve. And actually, if we achieve within that system, we've done a bloody good job of it. But there's many people that cannot achieve within that system, no matter how hard they try. So therefore, it's important. The work that you're doing is about trying to see how to change that. And I think there's the phraseology that you've used in your book, which is struggle is necessary, progress is possible, equity is imperative. And I think that is the absolute mantra that we need to live by in order to make sure that going forward, change happens in a lot of these institutions so that, children, young people can grow up feeling like they have got hope and that it is possible for them to achieve what they want to achieve, and not just kind of following a narrative that's been set by other people, but actually forging their own paths and forging their own careers and how they want to go going forward. So, DJ, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on to the Dope Black Dads podcast. And to everyone that's listened, I hope you've really enjoyed the discussion that we've had. I definitely would love to have you on again because I think there's a lot of stuff that we could really kind of go to town on. Yeah, absolutely. But I like that, and I think it's good because I want to leave the listeners wanting more, and I think we definitely need to organise something in the coming months to kind of to go over other things as well. So DJ, I appreciate you. Thank you very much, and respect and love the work that you're doing, and look forward to hearing more about the successes that you're achieving with the work that you're doing. And to everyone that's been listening, this has been the Dope Black Dads podcast. Thank you very much, and we'll catch you on the other side.